In the remote tributaries where Brazil dissolves into unmarked territory, there are stories the river people refuse to tell outsiders. Stories about anacondas so vast they create currents when they move, serpents that swallow entire caimans without uncoiling, creatures the forest itself seems to protect with walls of impenetrable green. For decades, herpetologists dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, the inevitable inflation that happens when fear meets folklore. But what if the scientists were measuring the wrong rivers, asking the wrong guides, looking in places the giants abandoned generations ago when boats with motors first arrived? The green anaconda, Eunectes murinus in clinical terms, officially reaches lengths of 5 to 6 meters, occasionally stretching to 9 in exceptional specimens. These are the numbers published in peer-reviewed journals, the measurements taken from snakes captured near human settlements or found dead after flooding. But the Amazon River basin covers 5.5 million square kilometers, an area larger than India, and 90% of it has never felt a researcher's boot. The indigenous Yanomami have a word that doesn't translate cleanly, yakuruna, a serpent that belongs to the river itself, not to the animal kingdom scientists catalogue. Their shamans speak of anacondas that remember when their ancestors first arrived, snakes that have shed their skin more times than any human has counted harvests. The legend crystallized in the accounts of Spanish conquistadors pushing up the Rio Negro in 1541. Francisco de Orellana's expedition chronicled serpientes tan grande como vigas, snakes as large as roof beams that capsized canoes by simply surfacing beneath them. His scribe, Gaspar de Carvajal, described an encounter where warriors retreated from a sandbar after seeing a serpent of such girth that 20 men with outstretched arms could not encircle it. The Spanish dismissed this as delirium from fever or fermented cassava, but Carvajal was a Dominican friar trained in observation, not prone to fantasy. He sketched what he saw: a serpent with a head broader than a horse's chest. 3 centuries later, British naturalist Percy Fawcett, the same man who vanished searching for his lost city of Z, recorded an incident in his 1906 expedition journals that his sponsors insisted he redact before publication. Fawcett claimed his boat crew refused to paddle a certain stretch of the Rio Abuna after spotting what he measured from a safe distance as a serpent extending at least 45 feet from head to visible tail, with unknown length still submerged. His surveyor's training made him cautious with estimates, yet he wrote, "I have never subscribed to exaggeration in the wild, but this creature exceeded any parameters I was prepared to accept." The Royal Geographical Society quietly shelved that section of his report. Acknowledging such a serpent would mean acknowledging that perhaps the Amazon still held apex predators science had no framework to classify. The Makushi people of northern Brazil maintain detailed oral histories of Camudi, the great serpent passed down through generations with the precision reserved for essential survival knowledge. Their accounts aren't vague campfire tales, but specific. The great anacondas inhabit flooded forest zones called Igapo during high water season, preferring areas where blackwater rivers meet whitewater tributaries, creating temperature gradients that confuse prey. They describe hunting behavior that matches predator patterns: ambush from below, constriction that stops the heart before crushing bone, and a patience that allows the serpent to wait submerged for days if necessary. These aren't stories meant to frighten children. They're tactical briefings for hunters who need to understand what shares their rivers. In 1948, a Brazilian army patrol mapping the border with Venezuela reported finding a shed anaconda skin measuring 52 feet when laid out and measured with surveyor's tape. The report reached the Ministry of Defense and immediately classified. A Belgian priest named Father Victor Heinz, stationed at a mission along the Rio Negro, photographed what he claimed was a living anaconda of similar size in 1960. The photograph shows a dark serpentine form in murky water, alongside a canoe for scale, but the image quality, grainy, taken from distance, allowed skeptics to dismiss it as floating logs or digital artifact from poor film processing. Father Hines died in 1973, and his original negative vanished from mission archives. What remains is a second-generation copy and the testimony of locals who insist the priest saw the old mother of the river. She let him see her, then she left. Modern herpetology approaches these accounts with institutional caution. Dr. Jesus Rivas, one of the world's leading anaconda researchers, has spent 30 years studying the species in Venezuelan llanos. His largest confirmed specimen measured 28 feet, extraordinary by any standard, but half the length of the creatures described in historical accounts. Rivas doesn't dismiss the giant anaconda reports outright. Instead, he emphasizes the challenge. Anacondas are ambush predators. They don't bask like crocodilians. They don't migrate predictably like sea turtles. A truly massive anaconda in deep Amazonian backwaters could avoid human contact indefinitely. Our absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's evidence of insufficient looking. The Amazon's defensive architecture makes comprehensive surveying nearly impossible. Satellite imagery penetrates the canopy poorly, revealing river courses, but not what inhabits them. Ground expeditions face logistical nightmares. Flooded forests where water levels fluctuate 20 meters seasonally, transforming terrain completely. River channels that shift course during flood season, erasing landmarks, and vegetation so dense that machete progress measures in meters per hour. A 50-foot anaconda could inhabit a territory the size of Luxembourg and never encounter a human researcher in its lifetime. The jungle doesn't need to actively hide these creatures. Its sheer immensity is concealment enough. Then there's the question of motivation. Why would a giant anaconda approach areas where humans operate? Smaller anacondas tolerate proximity to villages because human activity attracts prey. Capybaras, caimans, fish concentrations. But a serpent large enough to take adult tapirs or river dolphins has no need for the margins where humans fish and travel. It can penetrate zones inaccessible to boats, hunting in permanently flooded forests where the water never fully drains, territories that remain unmapped and unnamed. These serpents would exist in what anthropologists call voluntary isolation, not hiding from humans deliberately, but simply occupying ecological niches where human presence never extends. The handful of researchers who pursue giant anaconda evidence face a peculiar challenge. Indigenous communities who might guide them often refuse. This isn't superstition, it's practical theology. Many Amazonian peoples maintain that certain creatures belong to the spirit world as much as the physical, and disturbing them invites catastrophe. The Tucano people of northwestern Brazil believe the giant anacondas are Yai Bahari, guardians of sacred water sources, and that photographing or killing one would poison the rivers for generations. A Western scientist might scoff, but these communities have inhabited the Amazon for 12,000 years. Their taxonomies evolved from direct observation over hundreds of generations. When they say a place belongs to the serpent, they're not speaking metaphorically. In 2008, a petroleum survey team working in Ecuador's Yasuni National Park reported an incident that entered company files but never reached academic journals. The crew's boat struck something in the Napo River that they initially assumed was a submerged log. When the log moved, displacing enough water to rock their 20-foot launch, they realized their error. The company's incident report describes an unidentified aquatic reptile of exceptional size and notes that the crew refused to return to that river section, forcing the company to reroute their survey at considerable expense. The report specifies no length, just the notation, larger than vessel. Oil companies have no incentive to fabricate snake encounters, yet the incident remains unpublished, shared only through informal channels among field workers who understand the Amazon contains things petroleum engineers aren't trained to handle. What modern science knows with certainty is that the Amazon produces gigantism in unexpected species. The arapaima fish, once dismissed as local myth, grows to 3 meters and 200 kilograms. The black caiman reaches 6 meters, dimensions rivaling Nile crocodiles. The harpy eagle, heaviest raptor in the Americas, snatches sloths from treetops with talons larger than grizzly bear claws. The river environment provides abundant prey, minimal seasonal variation, and ecological niches that reward size. A serpent that could grow perpetually throughout its lifespan, and anacondas never stop growing, might reach proportions that would seem impossible anywhere else on Earth. The question isn't whether biology permits such size. It's whether enough unmolested territory exists for such creatures to mature undisturbed. Perhaps they did once, and don't anymore. Historical accounts from the 1500s-1700s describe giant anacondas with consistency that fades after 1900. As rubber tappers, missionaries and military patrols penetrated deeper into the basin, giant anaconda reports shifted to ever more remote tributaries. The Javari Valley, the Upper Purus, the uncontacted zones of Roraima. This pattern suggests not extinction, but displacement. The truly massive serpents retreating to the final refugia where motorboats don't reach and GPS coordinates remain unmarked. If you were a 50-foot ambush predator that had survived centuries by avoiding threats, you would recognize the sound of approaching engines and the scent of exhaust, and you would move to waters where those signals never penetrated. The couple who arrived at the dust-choked airstrip in Acre State understood this displacement theory. He was a Caucasian man in his late 30s, short dark hair, dark stubbled beard, angular face with defined jawline, intense dark eyes, weathered tan skin, wearing dirt-stained olive-green expedition shirt and cargo pants, heavy backpack with camera equipment strapped across chest. She emerged next. A Caucasian woman in her late 20s, shoulder-length light brown hair with blonde highlights, oval face, striking blue-green eyes, fair skin streaked with dirt and sweat, wearing olive-green expedition jacket and tactical pants, binoculars around neck, determined expression that didn't waver when the oppressive heat hit. They weren't thrill-seekers or documentary filmmakers looking for dramatic footage. They were field biologists with a specific hypothesis. If giant anacondas still existed, they would inhabit zones where human activity was recent enough that displacement was incomplete, but intense enough that the serpents had learned to avoid standard survey methods. The cargo they unloaded reflected serious preparation. Waterproof equipment cases, satellite phone, medical kit, climbing harnesses and rope, thermal imaging camera, underwater housing for the main camera, and enough battery reserves for 2 weeks of continuous recording. The small riverine community where they landed, a cluster of wooden houses on stilts above the floodline, watched with the weary patience of people who've seen outsiders come and go. Most arrive seeking jaguar photos or ayahuasca ceremonies. Few seek the serpent. Fewer still survive the attempt with their certainty intact. The couple's Portuguese was functional but accented, enough to negotiate but not enough to catch the nuance when the boat owner asked, "You want to find the snake or you want to survive the jungle?" They answered the question they heard, not the question he asked. The boat owner, a man whose face carried the deep creases of 6 decades reading rivers, agreed to transport them upriver, but refused to guide them into the interior. "I take you to the mouth of the Igarapé," he said, using the term for the narrow blackwater creeks that web through flooded forest. "After that, you need someone who knows the old ways." That someone materialized that evening as the couple sat on the dock reviewing maps. The guide was Yanomami by heritage, but raised in borderland communities where traditional knowledge mixed with practical experience in dealing with outsiders. He studied their satellite maps with the polite amusement of someone who knows terrain can't be flattened into 2 dimensions. "You have maps," he said finally. "Do you have rules?" When they asked what he meant, he began listing: "Never enter water you cannot see through, never make unnecessary noise. If you find a trail, observe before approaching. If the forest goes silent, freeze. And the most important, if you find the great serpent, do not think you found it. It allowed you to find it. The distinction matters." They spent 3 days in preparation that felt like negotiation. The guide insisted on specific equipment modifications, removing anything reflective that might catch light underwater, wrapping camera housings in dark fabric to reduce profile, changing their clothing to earth tones that wouldn't contrast sharply with jungle palette. He taught them to walk differently, weight on the outer edge of the foot first, testing before committing, minimizing the crack of twigs that broadcasts position. They practiced silence until their movement through the forest became a whisper rather than an announcement. The woman, initially frustrated by what seemed like superstition, gradually recognized it as tradecraft. This was how you approached an apex predator in its territory without triggering defensive or predatory response. The boat journey upriver took them through landscapes that transitioned from disturbed to primeval. The first hours passed, scattered homesteads and manioc plots, evidence of human presence even this far from towns. Then the clearings disappeared. The river narrowed. The sound of the motor became an obscenity against the insect hum and bird calls that filled every acoustic space. When they finally cut the engine at the mouth of the Igarape the guide had selected, the silence felt absolute for exactly 3 seconds before the jungle's true soundtrack resumed. A layered symphony of life at every frequency, from the bass rumble of howler monkeys to the ultrasonic chirps of insects they couldn't even see. The Igarape entrance looked unremarkable, a gap in the riverside vegetation barely wider than their boat, water the color of strong tea stained by decomposing leaves. The guide maneuvered them 50 meters in before the creek became too shallow and choked with submerged roots. They secured the boat and began unloading gear, each movement deliberate, nothing splashing unnecessarily. The guide pointed to marks on the muddy bank, parallel grooves in the soft earth that might have been made by something heavy, dragging itself from water to land or land to water. They could have been caiman tracks. They could have been something else. "Here," the guide said simply. "This is where the territory begins." The flooded forest they entered existed in a perpetual state between land and water. During high water season, the entire area would lie under 3 meters of flood. Now, in the receding period, water remained knee-deep in most places, deeper in channels carved by current. They waded more than walked, each step testing stability on submerged roots and mud that could shift from solid to quicksand texture without warning. The man kept the camera in a chest harness, ready to film at any moment. The woman maintained a running GPS log, marking waypoints every 100 meters so they could navigate back even if visibility dropped to 0. An hour into the trek, they found the first substantial evidence, a massive shed anaconda skin draped across low branches like abandoned laundry. Anacondas shed several times per year, and this skin showed the distinctive pattern, dark ovals against olive background, of green anaconda. But the scale was wrong. The guide helped them stretch it for measurement, 4.7 meters, remarkable but not record-breaking within the range of known specimens. Except this was only a fragment. The head and tail sections were missing, torn away by scavengers or decay. What they held might represent merely the midsection of something considerably larger. The woman photographed it from multiple angles, while the man packed a small sample into a sterile container. DNA analysis would later confirm it as Eunectes murinus, but with genetic markers suggesting age that pushed the boundaries of reptile longevity studies. The guide's posture changed. His movements became more measured, his attention more divided, watching the water, watching the canopy, watching behind them with equal priority. "We are noticed," he said quietly. When the man asked if he meant by the snake, the guide shook his head. "By everything. The forest knows we are here now." What happens next depends on whether she sees us as threat or just passing through." They pressed deeper, following subtle markers the guide read in disturbed vegetation and water flow patterns, signs invisible to the trained eyes of the scientists, but clear as highway signs to someone who'd learned to read jungle topography. By late afternoon, they reached an area where the forest architecture changed. The water deepened to chest height in places, and the tree canopy closed overhead so completely that only fragmentary light penetrated, creating a twilight atmosphere even at midday. This was Igapo in its purest form, permanently or near-permanently flooded forest where fish swam between tree trunks and aquatic plants grew on what would normally be dry land. The guide called a halt, gesturing for silence. At first they heard nothing unusual, just the constant ambient sound. Then they realized what was missing: bird calls. In Amazonia, silence from birds means a predator is near, and not just any predator, but something large enough that its presence clears the entire local airspace. They found the kill site 10 minutes later, a partially submerged capybara carcass wedged between roots. The animal showed no bite marks, no tearing, just the characteristic pattern of constriction death, ribs crushed inward, internal hemorrhaging visible through the skin's bruising. But capybaras are wary animals that don't enter water without checking for threats. Whatever killed this one had struck from ambush with speed that didn't allow escape. The carcass was fresh, less than a day old by the guide's assessment. They documented it quickly but didn't linger. A predator that abandons a kill this size either plans to return or has already fed so thoroughly it can afford waste. The water's surface rippled. Not wind, the air was utterly still. Not fish. The ripples moved with too much purpose, radiating from a point 30 meters away where the flood merged into deeper channel. The guide's hand moved in a gesture they'd practiced: freeze, crouch, watch. They sank into the water until only heads and cameras remained above surface, becoming part of the flooded landscape rather than intruders upon it. The man activated the camera's low-light mode, trusting electronics more than his own vision in the dim forest interior. The woman controlled her breathing, each inhalation deliberate and silent, her biologist's mind racing through predator-prey calculations, sightlines, escape routes, water depth, swimming speed differential between human and anaconda. The bubbles appeared first, not the random percolation of decay gas, but the rhythmic pattern of respiration, something large drawing breath underwater through specialized anatomy. Anacondas can remain submerged for up to 40 minutes, slowing their metabolism to near dormancy, but they must surface eventually. These bubbles suggested something approaching that limit, something preparing to breach. The guide's eyes widened, not fear exactly, but recognition. He mouthed a single word: Yakuruna, the river serpent, the one that doesn't follow normal rules. The head began to emerge from the dark water, slowly, deliberately, as if the creature itself understood the weight of this moment. A revelation that would change everything these researchers thought they knew about what still lived in the Amazon's hidden heart. What surfaced next would either confirm centuries of dismissed testimony or shatter the boundaries of accepted biology. In that infinite second before revelation, the jungle held its breath alongside them, waiting to see if humanity was finally ready to acknowledge what the forest had been guarding all along. The encounter that follows would test not just their courage, but their understanding of what it means to truly see something the world insists cannot exist. Join us in part 2 as we witness the moment when legend breathes, moves, and looks back with ancient eyes that have watched the Amazon long before humans learned its name.